Hello and welcome to Room 1 at Kent's Hill, where in a moment we'll be hearing from the famous Jim Bacon, G3YLA. I think we've all come across Jim either through our amateur radio experiences or back in the day when he used to be a weatherman on the BBC. He's going to talk to us about Sporadic-E, but you don't really need any further introduction, Jim.
Yeah,
it's all yours.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, it's good to have an introduction outside there, so that's great. And to save you time later on, I realise I'm probably being used as the gatekeeper for the raffle to stop you all leaving. But I've found the winning tickets, so we're okay. Panic over. You can forget about that. Right. There's some good news and some bad news on the Sporadic-E side. I was working on this talk all this last week, finishing up the data for this current season, and the good news is this talk, having tweaked it today, is now half the size that it was. The bad news is it's now still twice the size that it should be. So hopefully we're going to get through enough of this to be interesting, and what it basically is going to deal with is how Sporadic-E in the more recent years, while we've all been locked down, has added a lot of new stuff. We've heard from some fantastic talks today on the Sporadic-E and the ionosphere side and from space weather, that it's a really hot topic for amateurs to be involved in. And I just feel privileged to have a connection in that world, because I feel I learn so much talking to people who are very much experts in the field. And it's impressive what our community is able to contribute to the both to the professional side and to other amateurs. So what we're going to do then is to look first of all at the most recent years, and then perhaps to see how what we discover might apply to what took place in this year's events. Now, this could be a very long talk, but I'm hoping it's not going to be so long we can't get through some of the interesting bits. But because Sporadic-E does tend to be quite a complex subject, for those of you who haven't met it before, I just want to put a couple of slides up to introduce a bit of background. And one is this slide, which I tend to refer to quite a lot because it helps me stay on the straight and narrow. And the problem is that Sporadic-E involves lots of things. All of these things up the top here are to do with the E region and where Sporadic-E happens. There's the bit in the middle, and then there's a bit down here which got me interested, the weather. And there are many discussions and well-researched papers that provide links between these two regions. And one of the things that I get involved in a lot is how these weather events might produce gravity waves, which is what this AGW stands for, atmospheric gravity waves, just wave motions in the air that can propagate up to the E region and affect the way ionized material behaves. And the ionized material is largely driven by the meteor input. So we had that fantastic talk this morning on the Meteor Beacon project, and we're going to get some really exciting data from that from Brian and his team, and that's going to really add something into this discussion. The other thing which I've been spending a bit of time playing with, idle hands during lockdown, has been learning how to do some programming. I used to be a programmer back in the days of Fortran in the Met Office, when we had 5-hole paper tape and punched cards that you spilled on the floor as you walked around the building, and disasters like that. So I'm just resurrecting, like a lot of us come back into the hobby again after a long absence. I've picked up the coding sheets, and I'm doing a lot of work with Python and Matplotlib, so we'll see some of that in a minute. But one of the things that quite intrigued me was how the ionosonde data is very good at revealing some of the insights of the time of day business of Sporadic-E. We get used to this notion that you tend to get two peaks, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, early evening. And it occurred to me that that's something that's taken as a given without necessarily having much notion in the amateur community about where the data can be accessed. So I found ways of doing that. And the other thing, in reading about one of the next developments I want to add to this, putting the KP index in, because this whole Sporadic-E wind shear business is fundamentally backed up by the Earth's magnetic field being in a fairly stable state, and the K index is a good indicator of that, the KP index. So one of the papers that came to light was from the Helmholtz Institute, which published the paper on accessing their big KP index archive, so you can feed data into a database. And this one I thought, that's interesting. I hadn't appreciated quite how regularized the dips in the KP, which is the red line here. This graph shows the period from about 1932 to 2019. So it's a long period record. The grey peaks are the solar cycles, the sunspot number, and the red line is the KP index. And it's quite interesting how you're almost tempted in a careless way to say, oh, well, when you've got a solar minimum, you've got a low value of KP historically, but it's not quite. When you look at it closely, you see that the peak in the KP index is a lag behind the peak of the sunspot number, and then you get a lot of noise and faffy stuff going on, and the minimum is usually just before the start of the next thing. But it just occurred to me, since we tend to hang our Sporadic-E hat onto the K index quite a bit, it's interesting to see what it looks like in a climatological sense. And I hadn't seen this particular paper before, so it was quite interesting. One of the things is you'd be tempted to say, well, actually, if you get a low minimum KP, it seems to be followed by a low sunspot number cycle. Now, that could be a load of squit and tommy rot, as we'd say in Norfolk, but actually I'm sure that those better equipped to know about these things will be able to explain all this and say what happens. So that I thought was interesting, but this is the bit that I was going to try and get to, which is to say that it's colourful, and it should lift your spirits on a grey day, but it's actually got some really useful stuff. So this is the climatology over that same period of the KP index, and January to December along the bottom there, and the time of day, the UTC time going up the axis. So we start at the bottom at midnight and go through the day, and midday is across the middle here. So in the summer, Sporadic-E season, you find that historically the KP index tends to be lower for the morning period. Now, that I hadn't appreciated, because we tend to look at this peak of Sporadic-E as being two peaks during the day, and we've always historically found that you get better activity for the afternoon and evening period than the morning one. But that could be just a function of when we've all come home from work, of course. But the KP index is on our side in the morning, which I thought was interesting. And then you get quite a good on-side component in the middle of winter. So December and January, you've got historically a low value KP. And I thought that too was quite interesting, because you do get these random and quite good openings in the middle of winter. And then in the equinoxes, where we're all now discovering that FT8, if there's any CW people in the room, I'm going to wash my mouth out after this, but I'm a fond supporter of FT8 as a propagation tool. I just think it's fantastic, because it throws up these weak signal paths when ordinarily we in the CW end of the band or on sideband wouldn't be aware existed. So consider now for a moment the equinox, and you see that in the spring and the autumn the KP climatology suggests it has a little dip in the middle of the day. And I've subjectively always had this notion that outside the main season, on the edges of it, you tend to get quite a few more openings around the middle of the day than at either end. And I thought, well, you could get 2 and 2 and make 4 out of that, or it could be 5. But it's an interesting graph, isn't it? That shows a relationship which perhaps some of you won't have come across before. So that's a distraction. Now, this is kind of the revision of this sort of how the wind shear theory works. What happens when you get gravity waves in the atmosphere is that if you look at a fixed place, the actual changes it imposes on the background wind field. The ideal world for Sporadic-E is you have a wind shear where winds blow in opposite directions at different heights, and because of the deflection force of the ionized material from the meteors in the presence of the Earth's magnetic field, it will converge them together to give you a layer that's dense enough to to refract the signals, and you get sporadic-E. What happens in reality is that this layer, these nodes, descend with time. So one thing that we tend not to speak of much in the sporadic-E operating sense is that the best distances will presumably, therefore, come at the beginning of an opening. Because if the layer is descending with time, your range will get shorter as the opening progresses. So what we end up with is this descending node, which is driven by what we know to be the semi-diurnal atmospheric tide, these winds that go up there and do the business. But it then gets modulated by these gravity waves from weather stuff. And the weather stuff will produce localized places where you get the interaction. So you've got your background carrier, if you like, from the descending semi-diurnal tides to give you a peak in the morning and in the early evening. But that would mean you'd get sporadic-E everywhere, twice a day. But you don't. It tends to be much more localized and focused. And that focusing, I think, is probably going to be something we can hang a hat on towards the window-generated component of atmospheric gravity waves, the weather-generated. You can see the programming world has grabbed me by the whatnots. So the weather component has affected where it happens. So the descending tidal nodes give the go condition, if you like, and then the weather bit tells you where it's going to be. There is something else to add in here, is that it doesn't get any lower than these typical height ranges, simply because as you get lower down, you tend to get more absorption and recombination goes on. So the ionization is being eroded from below as it gets lower. So you build up to maximum values, but there's always this loss going on. So it's a profit and loss account, really. Right, okay, so let's see what some of this programming distraction has got me. You know, when you look at an ionosonde, you've got the two key components, if you follow sporadic-E, the FOEs, the critical frequency of the sporadic-E, and the height, or the virtual height of the sporadic-E. So those are things that I thought, well, they're there on the database. This is the Lowell ionosonde database in the States, and it allows you to go in and extract the data streams, and I then put them in an SQL database, and then I have a tinker around with them. And one of the ways of displaying that data is to put them in for an individual day. For an example there, you've got height on the y-axis, so here we are at 150 kilometres, if you can't read those from home, and 80 kilometres at the bottom, and here we've got midnight, and goes all the way across to midnight, and here's midday. So you can clearly see descending heights of the FOEs, and you can see, okay, I've drawn them as straight lines, they're almost certainly not straight lines, but you could put a fit there which suggests there's one semi-diurnal tide in the morning, and there's another one in the evening. And then what's all this business going on in the middle? And that shows you that it's not as simple as you think. If you come up with a game plan, that's plan A, you almost invariably will find that you should have had a plan B and C and D in there somewhere to add into the mix. So the actual situation is much more complex than just two semi-diurnal tides. You've got other tidal components that interact with it. So these may well be to do with those. But the colour coding is a measure of the strength of, so the black line on here, just to recap, so we know where we're looking. The black line is the height of the E's layer, the sporadic-E patch. The colour coding represents the value of the FOEs. So the higher the frequency, if we get FOEs that will sustain 10 metres, I've shaded it a bluey colour. If it will go up to 6 metres, it becomes this olivey green colour, which is this colour here. So you can see that you tend to get these things appearing to have peaks some way down a slope. It may not always be at the bottom, but remember, the lower it gets, the more inclined you are to see the erosion from underneath due to the greater recombination going on. So it all sort of broadly, anyway, that kept me amused for a couple of months, programming that one. And then I thought, well, let's do it in the time of day sense, where we can see what the actual FOEs is. And here I've used colour-coded dots to suggest what time of day and these measurements are. So we get the height by the position of the dot, And you can see that for a sporadic E patch here, if you follow this line, as the event gets more intense, it goes through the pale blue area, which is 10 metres, to the 6 metre region here. So we get up to 6 metres, and this is in the evening because the colour coding is purple. But you can see there's stuff going on here earlier in the day at low values of FOE. So this isn't sporadic E necessarily that you would find unless you were on FT8 or something. This is a low value of FOEs. But it shows there's a lot going on, and which is why you get all these random heights that seem to go all over the place. Some of it is a new descending node, and some of it is already there, which is this main diurnal component in the blue here from the previous day just left. And you've got to also remember that for the random meteor input, you do also get a higher amount in the morning hours, those of you doing meteor scatter. So your delivery of fresh goods, new fuel for making sporadic E, is going to give you a better chance to scavenge it out in the morning period. And you might not have much left for the afternoon or evening one, but in this case you have. So that's how that graph ended up. But I thought it was a really nice way of saying, instead of just saying that's ease and it tends to be longer paths at the beginning of an opening, you can see that there is a trend if you follow a particular node down, that the actual measurements do confirm this tendency for it to focus on a fairly narrow height range. So then I thought, well, how can we combine all this complex malarkey on that big schematic at the beginning about the different elements that go together to make sporadic E? How can we get that sort of encapsulated on a map to know which way to beam and to work? And that was where the ease probability index came from. So I developed what I've been calling the EPI index until I realised that was about the same as calling it an HST train. So it's an HST train or an EPI index. So the EPI index is itself an index, and that is what we're going to be putting a map of. So let's have a look and see the sort of thing which you may have seen on the PropQuest website. The EPI index is fundamentally a mix of the weather parameters, which, remember, from the side of the fence where I'm coming, it's the weather bit in determining the geographical distribution of where ease is likely to happen. I'm not a space physicist, but we know in our amateur community various things that tend to modify whether ease happens, different times of the year, different values of KP index, and all that other stuff. So we have a weather component, and then I modify it. The uncruel amongst you could call these fudge factors. They are just factors that are used to either give it a boost or suppress something if it's not the right time for it. So sticking with the weather bit first of all, some of the things you'll be familiar with from PropQuest are the jet stream patterns. And it's always been a case that for a lot of the openings, it tends to be associated with jet streams. Tends to be, not all of them, but there's a great connectivity there. So is it the jet stream core speed that's responsible for these gravity waves? And in which case, why doesn't it always happen in the centre of the jet stream where the core speeds are strongest? Or is it possibly more to do with the entrance and exit of a jet stream where you've got the accelerated and decelerating motions going into it and out of it? That could generate some more turbulence. Could it be thunderstorms? They show up on these maps. Or could it be to do with what in effect is changing the barometer reading? This is an upper air chart, so 300 millibars in the old days. It's about 30,000 feet, and a contour is just the height of that pressure surface. So think of it in the normal sense as being the isobar map on the television. And then where the patterns are changing, this is like a sine wave on your oscilloscope, and sometimes it goes out of lock and the sine waves ripple across the screen, and sometimes they don't. And weather is stacked up to do that. It has remarkable contrasts in how quickly these patterns and disturbances move. Where they move quickly, you get these little focused concentrations of rapid contour changes. So is that going to be a symptom for generating gravity waves, a signal rather? And recently I've been getting a vibe about vorticity, So I've been showing vorticity, and the one thing, most of you won't be familiar with what the vorticity looks like in the atmosphere, but it tends to be associated with low pressure, with troughs where you get a change in direction, a kink over these contours, and it tends to occur in ribbons. You very rarely, except in the middle of big lows, get vorticity maxima that aren't just these thin ribbons. But as it turns out, when you look at Sporadic-E on the DX clusters and so on, there are many, many times when these little periods here, these little indicators of higher vorticity, do become significant. So the fudge factors now, time of day, so obviously that can be influenced by these semi-diurnal tides. The season, we've seen that the K index varies through the year, and we know that summer is the Sporadic-E season. Topography, there's some suggestion that mountains disturb the performance of a jet stream blowing over the top of them, so you get a lot more turbulence in mountain regions. The dip angle, which gives you a latitude focus for Sporadic-E, KP index we've done, the meteor input, which is what you make the stuff with, and possibly a solar flux component, because that may well affect things in a way in which I do not understand. So, where do we go from here? The one thing we've got to do, coming up with an index that you think is going to be a neat way of combining it all, is only any good if you can find ways of verifying whether it is any good. So the next step was to have a look at whether, say for a long path, you can find that when you do that for a multi-hop path, you do indeed find quite often that it correlates pretty well with maxima in the EPI. So it does have a flavour for being on the right track, and quite a few of them in very precise terms, like the one up here, there, is on the edge. Don't necessarily feel that it's in the middle, because the parameters that we used to create the EPI index initially was things like the core speed of the jet stream and things like that. And now I'm beginning to feel we need to flavour it more towards the vorticity maxima you get on the edge of a jet stream. The amount of spin in the air and the wind shear going on the edge of a jet stream is probably rather more interesting. Anyway, so the tough test. This is well, those of you involved in statistics and science professionally will say, oh my God. Because this is May, 1st of May through to the end of September. So the period is virtually all of our Sporadic-E season. Our lovely EPI index, well, EPI goes along here and the FOEs goes up here. You wouldn't come up with a big relationship on that one, because just about any value of EPI seems to correlate with any strength of FOEs. So disappointing. So we're not there yet. But there may be some things we can retrieve. Is it the velocity of the jet stream? Sometimes it is good to be able to say, no, we don't want to bother looking at that. You know, it isn't a failure if you run a series of tests and trials and find out that it rejects stuff that we've been hanging a hat on. So I'm not going to give up hope in this, but I am going to say that the velocity of the jet stream here on this one doesn't appear to be very positive for me. Vorticity may be worth a bit more of a look, because it seems to be biased more towards the positive side here than the negative side of vorticity. So in other words, favouring low pressure systems rather than high pressure features. But that could be just a function of the meteorology, the climatology at that time of the year, that we've had more low pressure systems rolling through. So maybe a longer period will do it. How about the direction that the jet stream blows from? Well, you think, oh, this is promising. We've got a nice little session here. But if you think about it, our prevailing weather systems are more likely to produce southwesterly to westerly winds. So there may be no surprise here, but it's worth a bit more investigation to see whether an independent look at it without considering the E's response would come up with this distribution for wind speed. This one, the contour change, whether the barometer value is going up or down, doesn't seem to be a very significant one. Somebody said, well, what about surface wind gusts at the surface? That doesn't appear to do very much. Another turbulence index, which is used in aviation, that doesn't appear to do very much. We've got one here that looks promising. So I'm quite pleased with this, that it does show over a whole season there is a definite tendency to find that the higher values tend to converge in that window between about 100 and 110 kilometres. So operationally, what do we get from that? Well, I suppose being positive about what is a negative set of figures at the moment, you'd say that tells us if you're going to do calculations on path distances, using a value of between 100 and 110 kilometres is not a bad figure to pick. You know, at least it gives you some ground rules to work from there. And there was two more I was looking at. Vorticity change, that's a fairly scattered thing. And CAPE, I probably should explain, that's an amount of energy. It's called convectively available potential energy. And what it means is how big a thunderstorm you can make, in other words. So the people who firmly and really vociferously believe it's thunderstorms, they may be right, but it doesn't show up in the scatter plot here that it's right. You're not getting necessarily a very strong, but this could be just a small sample size of one season and not many big thunderstorms. And bear in mind, because all of this data analysis has been done for daubs in Belgium, you've got to be really lucky that the best sporadic-E that happens in the season is right over that ionosonde, and that's where the big thunderstorm is to test the CAPE value and all the rest of it. So there's a long way to go with studies like this before you go. But from one season, this is what this is about, from one season, many weather parameters have been looked at and no strong single parameter comes out. So that's where we're at the moment. That's not to say we won't find something if we look in a slightly different way at some of the other parameters, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. So the things that people have been saying and feeling and don't appear to work, jet stream strength and the surface wind speed are not important. Some of these distributions for one season are probably driven by the meteorology of this summer and are nothing to do with the link to sporadic-E. We have gained knowledge that for the maximum FOEs tends to favour that height range. We do know that we've got a bit more work to do, peeps, and we've got to actually try and find something that we can add to this to develop it further. So let's have a closer look at the upper wind direction, so the jet stream direction. And the colour coding represents the highest FOE frequency. So red is 4 metres. And it would be very unreasonable to expect that we're going to capture the single only 2 metre patch of E's over daubs in a given year. But anyway, so here's this gap. So is this gap just climatology, or are we more likely to get higher values of FOEs from certain wind directions? The idea was to try and track down any link to mountains and whether that affects the flow and the generation of these gravity waves. Well, Daubs isn't in a particularly hilly part of the world, so I thought, well, let's do Roquetas in Spain, and here it's positioned, oh, I'm pointing at my screen instead of doing this. Here, we've got a sector between about 050 and 210, where it's coming in from the Mediterranean, and you do get reduced number of events. But again, that could be climatology. But the stronger events, the number that's got most values, tends to be from these mountain directions. Now, that may be a coincidence. It probably is. But all these directions from 210 round through here to 050 have higher values than the bit coming in from the Mediterranean. So you could use that, so, oh yeah, it's mountains, but I don't think it necessarily is. It could again be climatology of the Mediterranean in the summer. But it's good to know these things, to see where to look. So if you plot it like this, between vorticity change and contour change, then you've got a bigger spread in the vorticity change, which is the vertical bit going up and down, than in the height, the actual pressure that you tap on your barometer. Positive vorticity seems to be more significant than negative. So anticyclones you'd expect to crop up more in fine summer settled weather, but they don't. So the sporadic-E coming from the positive vorticity side may be interesting. And you could be tempted to say, is it worth looking at the ones clustered near the centre, possibly from a different cause to the ones that are spread out with the larger values? So there's a small family of events that comes from the background field, if you like, for this time of the year, and this very small subset that's to do with something else more active, maybe. So that's what the whole season looks like. There's a lot. On this top slide, this is the measurement of FOEs from the Dobbs ionosonde, and this is the EPI plot. So let's concentrate on the top bit. And you can see that throughout the year, there's quite a few that breach the 4 metre value. This isn't whether amateurs worked it, by the way. So before you sort of feel this is the arm waving bit, this is actual physical ionosonde data that says it reached a value equivalent to 4 metres. So you can see they happen fairly regularly in Dobbs through the summer months, from roughly about mid-May to the first week in September. So that's your Sporadic-E season-ish. And then if you have a look at it in more detail, in that time, 27% of the reports of E's, these are 5-minute readings they take through the season, 27%, just over a quarter, don't reach as high as 10 metres. Nearly 60% get you into 10 metre activity, about 11% 6 metres and 5% 4 metres. So round figures, 25%, 60%, 10 and 5, you know, of the openings to the different bands during the whole season. And in terms of the EPI index, you're 4 times more likely to get an FOEs above 10 metres when the EPI is between 50 and 75 compared to the lower values or the very high values, which is just a rarity of it. But anyway, it's an interesting exercise. And this is a way of examining those months individually. And you can see that June stands out here as being the one that offers the greater proportion of ionosonde readings that would allow you to get to 6 metres, and then it tails off slightly. But July and August, very similar. They're still quite high. You know, they're still good Sporadic-E months, and the 4 metre ones still useful, but by the time you get to September, you're scrapping around a bit. Okay, so I had said I'd selected 2 days, but to save you from great turmoil and angst waiting for your raffle tickets, I've now made this 1 day, and for 1 day only, you're going to see this one, the 7th of June, which some of you will remember as quite a good season, quite a good day. Huge opening over Eastern Europe, roughly aligned with a jet stream over Germany and Poland, so you could hang on to your hat with that. A lot of these events, you'll find jet streams are there or thereabouts. You know, if you look at it in that sense, you're fine. But looking at it from a point of view of a single ionosonde, it's very hard unless you're right underneath the path. So let's see what PropQuest found. That found quite a strong opening, approaching 10 megs in the middle of the day, and then it went into sort of almost afibrillation mode here in the late afternoon and evening for the last part of the day. And in terms of the weather pattern, here's the small jet stream that I mentioned over Poland, from Germany into Poland. So you could say, well, yeah, jet stream does have a certain connection there. Very fast moving flow coming across the Atlantic. This is when the weather changed and we got these ripples powering in. The thing that, well, okay, let me just point to vorticity. There's vorticity going on, but nothing huge except for this. Can you see on this one here, this very thin line just there? And that's how the computer models have picked up that thin ribbon of high vorticity on the edge of the jet stream. So jet streams are very important, not just for the core speed. It does appear that the vorticity showing up as a ribbon like that, and the other one coming in as well, is, see, this one here has moved from there earlier on in the day at 1200 to here at 1800. So it's moved from the UK across to the Low Countries. So moving systems are the deal. So I then thought, well, I'll write another program. So here's another one. And I just want to spend 2 minutes doing this, and then I'll pause for the pips, as Jim would say, and we'll have some questions. So the top one shows you this the vorticity, which is the purple line with the red shading underneath it. There's the contour height values, which are the contour change, which aren't necessarily dramatic, having looked at loads and loads of these. So let's see what happens to vorticity. It dips, becomes negative, so a bit, and then a huge rise comes in here. And this red figure is the vorticity change over the previous hour. So here we've got big increases in vorticity. So big increases in vorticity here. And when we look at the FOEs, you get big increases in FOEs corresponding to the time when you get big increases in vorticity. And the same, another increase in FOEs here, and another increase in vorticity here. And then the same thing here with this big change of increasingly positive vorticity with an increasing FOEs here. No jet stream shows up on the lower graph. So it's interesting, isn't it, that even once we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater and said these weather things don't produce much of a link, you can, if you look at certain parameters, for example, this potential link between changes in vorticity and increasing values of FOEs, you can see a link. And I've done several of these, and they do correspond fairly well. So my new go-to place, my new comfort blanket, is going to be vorticity change, ladies and gentlemen. And I think we might do a bit more work on that with other years of data and looking back through previous years. Anyway, looking at some of the other toys, you remember I produced these colour graphs. Look at that for a strong event. That's really a very focused. So you've got your descending semi-diurnal tide there, and you've got a little one in the middle which seemed to do the trick. The one later on didn't do much. Now, is that because it used up all the material later on? Earlier on in the first opening, because there's only, if you think what this is doing, this is capturing the ionisation and it's scavenging it and it's taking it away, and once it's moved through, you haven't got so much left up there where it's come from. So maybe the second descending node doesn't have as much to scoop up until you get another period when the Earth has spun round and you get a new delivery the following morning. You get them all the time, random meteors, but in terms of relative proportions. But you can see here on the bottom right graph how it focuses on a fairly narrow range. The one thing to say is that whenever you have low values of the critical ease frequency, there's always a lot of scatter with the height of the ease. And they all do go true to form and seem to behave and give you a peak based in this window between 100 and 110 kilometres. So what can we say? Well, we can say the EPI map appears to give usable pointers geographically, even if we don't quite know why it works yet. Some of the more obvious individual parts of weather don't seem to be as strongly linked as I thought. But some of the other bits, if you drill down a bit more, could provide some use. The aim of this is for me to be able to use the quality of most forecast models. I mean, weather forecast models are pretty blooming good these days. They're very rarely wrong. Yep. So at an upper air base, on an upper air basis, the 300 millibar chart is a very reliable chart to work from. So if we can find some links that we can pin back to there, that could give us a better calculation for the EPI, which will work better in future seasons. It's still worth looking at, but it's not quite there yet. So here's something which I'm getting very interested in. I mentioned vorticity changes, but this one, movement of the upper air pattern. You know, I said this event, we had a jet stream rippling in across the Atlantic. Now, you remember about 4 or 5 slides back, I showed you that tooth comb of all the openings on the graph from Dobbs. And there were loads of these events up to 4 metres. And all of those, the ones that I looked at them all on the 300 millibar upper air jet stream charts. They all had a fast moving trough shooting through the picture. You don't always get that every day in the summer. So what's going on there? And that's something that I only discovered on Wednesday, that when you look at that, they've all got a fast-moving trough. But, and this is the interesting thing, it doesn't have to be over daubs. There was one occasion where this fast-moving trough was about 1,500 kilometres away. So you know when you see air glow, I'm sure Colin may be able to advise on this, but the pattern of the air glow is it oxygen and nitrogen? Well, you get this sort of it looks like an aurora, but it's not. These are like if you do a long time lapse sort of capture of an image of the night sky, and in this air glow you'll see bands of slightly more intense patterns. And they drift across the sky. Evidence of gravity waves at that height, a little bit below sporadic-E, but not far short, about 100 kilometres, whatever. So the point is, there was a paper I looked at from a research paper in the Journal of Atmospheric Terrestrial Physics, and they found a pattern that was observed over the Norwegian Sea or over Norway was traced back to what was found to be an ageostrophic flow over Greenland, from a jet stream over Greenland being disturbed. So in other words, a very shallow propagation of jet stream activity that went all the way across the width of the Atlantic. So the fact that I've found these moving trough patterns as being present on every single day when we got as high as 4 metres means perhaps we need to look, not just we get so used to looking at where we think the sporadic-E patch is, without realising that some events can be driven by advection of, if you like, gravity waves from a long way away. So that was where I got to, and I thought, well, this is a blooming shame. I've got to something really interesting that could do with another 20 slides, and you haven't got time to work them out, and B, you want to go home, and C, I haven't had a chance to read up on all the papers. But that's the bit where I've got to next, and I do think that vorticity changes come into it because of what we saw on that detailed slide of the weather bit. But is it possible that we really now need to split it and look at two different things? So one is a close-in local lesser event, and perhaps there's also a class of E's that's caused by the stronger E's, caused by some of these advective properties from fast-moving patterns that generate gravity waves from a long way away. Because the thing about those is they might be more sustained. It might be a longer wave train that gives longer to produce the effect, and something more close in and local, like an individual thunderstorm, might be a poof, up, rumble, crash, gone, and it doesn't last long enough to converge the material. Anyway, super interesting stuff. But logs, and this is where I go through here and just say that's all a lot of stuff I'm going to do. And this is thanking the guys who do the website and the people who provide the professional database for the ionosondes, and get in touch, because I realise I've just about got to the end with no time for questions, which is exactly what I planned. But you can see how things change all the time in this subject. And the work that Chris is doing, and that we hear that Colin and the Met Office are doing, and Brian's doing with the Meteor Radar, the Meteor Beacon project, all these things are going to be adding new stuff all the time. And they're also going to be, because of your logs, it's going to be possible to validate these things in an amateur context, to say how this could help us in what we do. Anyway, thanks very much. I'll stop for the pips.
You haven't lost it, Jim. 5 seconds to go. We'd arranged for the applause to be at the point where the YouTube viewers actually opt out. So there we are. Brilliant. Right on time.